Hey, and welcome back to Fanatical Leica, the driest place on the internet. Today I'm going to do a step-by-step walkthrough of making a rope and leather camera strap from start to finish. This will include the parts done on the computer, the design work, and the CAD, as well as laser cutting, rope cutting, hand stitching, and attaching hardware, etc. So if any of that sounds interesting to you, please stick around.
Okay, let's get into it.
Just a note before we move on, the section in Inkscape is a bit on the long side, so if you're not as interested in the computer design part of this, you might want to skip ahead to around the 7-minute mark. Okay, so here we are in Inkscape, which is what I use for designing vector graphics. I like it because it is free, entirely free, so I highly recommend it if you're not sure if it's going to be something you are doing a lot of. Adobe Illustrator is very comprehensive, but essentially does all the same things, and that's a pretty expensive subscription, so I don't have one. My wife does a lot more illustrating work and works primarily in Illustrator, so often if there's something I can't figure out how to do in Inkscape, I'll send the file to her and she can help me out. But I figured since this is somewhat involved, rather than walk you through step by step the creation of this, I'd show you what a finished design looks like in vector form and sort of break it down. There's plenty of much better tutorials on the basics of how to use Inkscape, and that would take up a lot of time here. But essentially what we have here is the outline of the leather piece that we're going to cut on the laser cutter. I'll zoom out so you can see the entire thing. And it's symmetrical both vertically and horizontally. So really all we have to do is design 1/4 of this and then mirror it across this way and across this way. So the bulk of the time will be spent just in one portion of this. Now I have also imported my logo, which is another vector that I created in a separate file, but everything here is created with straight lines, some circles, and that's it. I did use a triangle primitive, and I'm not that creative. So after some trial and error, we arrived at the proper size for cutting these holes on our laser cutter, which I think is about 1.5 millimeters. If we zoom in, we can see, and actually we can grab our measure tool and show exactly how wide this is across. So it's 1.02 millimeters. And that's just one hole that's been copied into this path. And again, leather's a natural material, so the placement of these holes, while it may look not totally even here, when the leather is being stretched by having the rope inserted to it, this is what gave us the most natural looking appearance of the holes being evenly spaced. Then there's also holes down the center, which will be double stitched because this is where the rope actually anchors into the leather, and that's where we want to have the strongest grip. So the main outline shape, if I select it, is just a series of straight lines around the top and then two very simple curves that meet up in the middle here. And that's all there is to it. Now, the main thing with designing anything in Inkscape or Illustrator that you're going to actually produce, like for example cut on a laser, is making sure that your units and everything are to scale. I found this a little bit puzzling coming into Inkscape from having worked in CAD programs like Fusion 360 or AutoCAD, in that there are both units for the grid that apply to the program as a whole, and then unit settings that apply just to the particular document you're working on. So they live in two different places. So if you go down to Inkscape and settings, these are sort of the global settings. And I have grids set up here, and the colors for the major lines and minor lines. So I have it set up for spacing. Everything is metric. So there's a grid line every 1 millimeter, and then every 5 millimeters there's a pink line. So it's very quick, to determine units of 5 and 10 when looking at the grid. what got me confused was I was first working on this in what I thought were those units, and then when I take the measurement tool out, it would show me some much larger number, which was confusing. So you also have to make sure that your document properties, which is the document that you're currently working on, has the same settings. Now, right now it's set to pixels. I believe if I switch it to millimeters, it all adds up. So make sure that these match. I don't know exactly when one takes priority over the other, but I found that if they didn't match, I was having problems when I'd bring my file into the program that actually operates the laser, things not being the right size, and it was a big pain. So double check those things. So these are also set in 2 different colors so that when you bring it into the laser cutting program, it's easy to identify, say, the logo area, which is not going to be cut but actually etched into the leather, versus the blue lines, which are all going to be cut straight through, so the holes and then the outline of the piece. When you import an SVG or an Adobe Illustrator file directly into the laser app, it can identify the colors and put them on separate layers. So it's not actually looking at the layer setup that's in Inkscape. And when I export this as a plain SVG, these will all go away. But basically, once I have a design where I want it like this, I'll export it, and you can choose a variety of formats. Plain SVG is what we want because we want to preserve this as all vector information. We don't want this to be a bitmap that has some fixed resolution. These are all curves that are scalable, so if we zoom in, it's never getting, hopefully you understand the difference between vectors and bitmaps, but if you don't, these are all essentially mathematical curves that no matter how close we get, they are perfect, versus, say, something like a photograph, which is inherently a bitmap comprised of individual pixels, and as you zoom in, it gets blockier. So I hope that goes sort of without saying. But yeah, so we'll take this and we'll jump into Beam Studio, which is the program that runs our small desktop laser. So I've opened up Beam Studio on our PC, which is connected to the laser cutter, and it actually doesn't have a lot of controls, but you can see I've imported the design here. I made one slight modification, which is I'm adding a hole to the top here, which I'm going to fill with another piece of leather of a contrasting color. And I need to load some leather into the laser cutter, and then we'll run the camera so we can position our design over the exact spot of the leather that we want to cut. So 1 second while we do that. So now I've cut myself a small piece of leather. I just cut it with this rotary tool, which is incredibly sharp and perfect for cutting leather of pretty much any thickness. Just use a straight edge. And now I have to cover it with some masking tape over the top, the entire surface of the top, so that when the laser cuts through, it doesn't leave lots of scorch marks everywhere. So we have some large sheets of masking tape, which I can just go over the top, trim the edges, and then we'll load that. Okay, and so here is our piece of leather, which has been covered with our light masking tape. It's tape that doesn't leave a lot of residue, so it doesn't pull off the surface of the leather at all when you remove it. And then there's some strips of painter's tape holding it down onto the bed of the machine. And this is basically ready to go. So we're going to go back to Beam Studio, run the camera, align our artwork, and then we'll let it fly. Okay, and we're back in Beam Studio, and now I'm going to run our camera. I don't know how much of this you can see, but hopefully this will make sense. So it's communicating with the camera, and then I'm going to draw a box around the area of the work table that I want to photograph, and it's thinking. And in a moment we should see some images. Here we go. So the camera is moving across, and now we can see a good flat view of where our leather is on the work table. And I just have to position the artwork inside where the leather actually is. Make sure it's not hanging off the edge. Okay, so it's done with that. So I go back into my edit mode. I select everything that I want. Sorry, I'm doing this two-handed here. I don't have a screen capture things set up on this computer. But anyway, so now artwork is positioned over the center of the leather, and we just have to double check our settings. The area that I want to cut is all in blue, so I go and I select my blue layer, and I have a preset here for cutting leather that is 1/10 of an inch thick. I hope this is in focus. I apologize if not. I'll get screen capture going on this machine next time. But anyway, we have our artwork centered. We have our power settings set up here, and we're going to hit play on the machine. And then I will run over to the laser cutter so you can see this thing in action. So starting. And here we go. Okay, and that's it for the laser cutting. We have a nice piece with very clean edges and all of our holes for stitching already cut out. So now it's time to sew this one up and put it all together. So if you were watching closely in that last clip, I actually missed a stitch. I skipped over one hole. I guess even in time lapse, I'm self-conscious. So next up I have to cut some rope, which I'll do quickly off camera, and then I'll sew the rope into the two end pieces, and that's more or less the final assembly. Okay, so here I am measuring the length of rope against another strap that I have, and I'm taping up the ends where I'm going to make the cut. And then with a very sharp knife, I split it down the center, and using a little butane lighter, I melt the ends so it doesn't fray. And then putting the rope in the stitching pony, I'm going to start sewing it from the bottom up, and then I'm actually doing a double stitch. So once I get to the top, I sew it back down again. So there's 2 stitches in every hole, makes it, extra strong. So this is the first side, and then here we are sewing up the second side. And when I say we, I mean me. And I occasionally have to break out the pliers on the double stitches to pull the needle through because it gets quite crowded in the holes, which are pretty small. And that about does it for the stitching. And here are the finished ends. And you can see I put some black plated heavy-duty 20mm split rings on the end, which are very tough for my testing. So I hope some of this was interesting. If I skipped over any steps that you'd like to see more detail of, please let me know. I'm happy to show anything that's of interest. This video already feels like it's a bit on the long side with all the computer stuff, so I don't want to stretch it out too far. Anyway, I'll be back with more soon. Until next time, thank you.